Hey everybody, Dr. Sagrin here, and we are going to elaborate a bit on our biogeochemical cycle knowledge and of our calcium cycle knowledge by exploring a little bit about the chemistry of caves today. This isn't, like critically important knowledge for people to necessarily know, like how caves work, but it is pretty neat, and it gives us another excuse to play with chemicals. So let's jump right in with a little bit of background knowledge here for the lab. So let's talk some cave chemistry. And the main thing to know about caves is that caves are almost always made of limestone. So pretty much every cave formation in the world is going to be made of limestone, and we briefly talked about that previously, where I mentioned that acid in rain and in water will dissolve limestone and slowly eat away the rock, and that can lead to caves forming. Now, I will admit that I have been to several caves in my life and have really enjoyed being in them, and so maybe I'm a little bit more into caves than the average person. But I think you'll find that they're pretty cool. And the thing about caves that maybe people don't realize, if you have never really been in one, is it's not just like a hole in the ground. When you go inside a cave, depending on the system, there are unbelievable sights within a cave. It's otherworldly. There are crazy things hanging from the ceiling. There are just insane looking rocks and formations everywhere you look. The first time I went to a cave, it was called Carlsbad Caverns, which is pretty close to the New Mexico-Texas border. It's quite a drive from where I live in Houston. I think it's, I don't know, maybe 14 hours away. And I went there as a kid. I was just completely blown away by the spectacle of all these crazy looking things that were inside the cave. So much so that later on in life, when I got old enough to drive, I made several road trips with friends, 14 hours of driving away just to go visit the same cave. So if you ever have a chance to go to Carlsbad Caverns, I highly recommend it. And I've been to several other ones. You don't have to drive that far. In Texas, we actually have a lot of cave systems. They're not quite as cool as Carlsbad Caverns, and then they're sprinkled out throughout the rest of the United States. You have several systems. So what I want to get to explaining today is describing some of these different formations and spectacular structures that you see in caves and how they actually form, and relate it to the chemistry that we learned in the last two class periods. So just going over a couple examples of these formations. This type of formation is called a drapery, and it kind of looks like drapes, like curtains on your shower or on your windows, but that's all rock. It's all solid rock. You have these things called stalactites, which hang from the ceiling, and they are these crazy spiky things all over the place. And you also have stalagmites, which grow up from the ground. And all of these neat looking things combined are known as a term called speleothems. So all of these spiky looking things from the top and from the bottom are called speleothems. And when you get into really big caves, it's just breathtaking, all this stuff. And it begs the question, how do these things actually form? And that is going to provide a backdrop for our chemistry that we're going to learn today. All right, over here at our virtual lab demo center again. And we are going to do another experiment involving my favorite rock, I guess, at this point, which is limestone. So last couple videos, we've learned that limestone is a base and it will react with acids, and we showed that it would dissolve as well in an acid.
And so that's what I've done overnight. I have had a solution of hydrochloric acid, and at the bottom of that you can see the limestone, and I just let it soak overnight. And so basically all of the limestone that could dissolve has been dissolved in here over a period of about 24 hours. And I also did the same thing with vinegar. Vinegar is also an acid. It's a little bit weaker acid, and it might work a little better for this experiment that I'm about to show you. So I let this soak overnight in vinegar, this limestone, and really dissolve as much as I possibly could let it. And now what I've done is that I have taken just the liquid part, so none of the rocks, and I have taken it out of these containers, and let's take a closer look at these.
Alright, so we have our two solutions here. This one is hydrochloric acid, or was hydrochloric acid, but it has soaked overnight with limestone, calcium carbonate. And you can see that it's very clear. Maybe if you're looking really, really closely, you'll notice a little bits of things floating around in there, but basically it looks like water. And here is our vinegar, and you notice the same thing. Pretty much clear. You would think it was water if you didn't know it better. So something else that we can look at with these two solutions is their pH. So I have a container here of fresh vinegar. Let's see what the pH of that is. So we notice a pretty obvious color change there, and we can match this up with the pH, and that's way below 7, so this is a pretty decently strong acid here. Now let's check our vinegar that we soaked overnight with limestone. Let's see, what is our pH there? So it's still acidic. It still smells a bit like vinegar, but not as strong. We can hold up these two together. You can clearly see that the vinegar, the fresh vinegar that hasn't had limestone soaked in it, is much more acidic. And the reason for that is the vinegar reacted. The vinegar is an acid and the limestone is a base, and they reacted overnight. And in the process, they kind of canceled each other out and became more neutral. And we see the same thing with the hydrochloric acid. This would be like blood red normally if it was fresh hydrochloric acid, but you can see it's kind of just a weakish orange color. Still a weak acid, but considerably weaker than it was when it was fresh hydrochloric acid. Alright, now we're going to bring our friend ammonia back into the mix. We already checked ammonia in our last virtual lab, and let's just double check what its pH is again to remind everybody. Alright, our pH check on ammonia, just to remind everybody, we see it's a deep blue color. Ammonia is a very strong base, so now it's going to be a little bit of a hypothesis time. What I'm going to do, and just to kind of overview here, let's do the vinegar first. Vinegar was an acid, and overnight I put limestone in this vinegar, and the limestone dissolved. And in the last lecture I mentioned that the calcium in the limestone, as it dissolves, does not disappear, but rather it is carried in the solution. So it is mixed in there with the water. You can't see it, but it's there. So my question to you is, what's going to happen when I add a very strong base to this weak acid that has dissolved limestone in it? What do you think? Make some predictions. Alright, so I'm going to mix them together, and note this vinegar is a very clear liquid. You can see it just looks like water, it's so clear. This ammonia is a very clear liquid. It looks like water, it's so clear. Let's see what happens when we mix these two together.
There's our vinegar with dissolved calcium. And here comes our ammonia. Whoa, what did you notice happened? Let me hold it up to you for the light. That is not a very clear liquid. And I also want to show you something else, but it's going to require us to watch over the period of several hours again. So let's go ahead and hit the fast forward motion. All right, so we can see that over that period of about, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours, the solution now, again, is no longer cloudy because you can see at the very bottom most of that calcium is now resettled out of the solution. So what does this mean? Well, basically what we can learn from this is that calcium carbonate will dissolve in an acidic environment, but if that dissolved calcium is put back into a basic environment, it will undissolve, for lack of a better word. And actually, the term in chemistry, the official term for this is precipitation. This is a precipitation reaction.
All right, so let's kind of debrief on that chemistry that we just saw. And if you notice, I'm wearing another shirt. I'm filming this on another day. The hydrochloric acid reaction kind of produced a strange response where when the calcium precipitated out of solution, it was kind of bluish, greenish, brownish with the hydrochloric acid, which was strange. And then over the course of a bit more time, another day or so, some other strange colors started appearing in the hydrochloric acid bottle. I started researching it and trying to figure out what exactly happened, and I got distracted, and anyway, I didn't film the rest of my lab after that. Anyway, it goes without saying, if there's any teachers out there watching this, that this particular precipitation reaction seems to work better with vinegar than hydrochloric acid. My guess is that the hydrochloric acid is a stronger acid, and this limestone I'm using, and any limestone out there, is not pure calcium carbonate. When you think about how limestone is forming out of seashells or out of precipitate at the bottom of the ocean, it's not going to be pure calcium carbonate. There's going to be little bits of mud and sand and whatever's in the water kind of mixing in. And so those impurities are possibly drawn out by the hydrochloric acid more than the vinegar. And if you're trying to do a nice demo where you see the calcium dissolve and then precipitate out as a nice whitish color, vinegar is the way to go. Anyways, so kind of getting back to our debrief idea, we saw a couple things here. Obviously, we can dissolve limestone with an acid. And in our last video lecture, I was talking about how all those calcium atoms are still there. They're just dissolved in the water. And you can hold the water up to the sunlight, and it looks clear. You can't see any of the calcium. It just looks like water, but it's all still there. And now we have shown that, yes, not only is it still there, but we can make it reappear and undissolve or precipitate out of the solution if we put it into a basic environment, which we used ammonia to do. Okay, I thought this was going to be about caves somehow, right? What does this have to do with caves and these cave formations that we see in caves? Well, let's get back to our PowerPoint and find out how. All right, so as a reminder, rainwater is acidic. As the raindrops are falling through the air, there's little bits of carbon dioxide in the air that when it mixes with water creates carbonic acid and makes rain a little bit acidic. Then this slightly acidic rain hits the ground. It's not so acidic that it kills anything. It's a really mild acid. Plants are adapted to survive in it. But as the water percolates through the ground, and what I mean by percolate is as our rain is hitting the surface here, percolation means basically as it winds its path down through the soil. And as this happens, the rainwater will pick up even more acid. Plant roots will release carbon dioxide, and also all kinds of bacteria and whatnot living in the soil will release carbon dioxide as well, and some other things. And all of this increases the acidity of our water. So if rain starting out is 7, it's about neutral. And as it falls through the air, it's picking up carbon dioxide. It lands at maybe about a 5.5. And we're talking about the pH scale here. So it's getting more and more acidic. As it's done working its way through all the soil, it might be as acidic as 3.5 or so. That would be very acidic soils. And so it's picking up more and more acidity as it goes down. In places in the world where you have limestone, rock, basically as it's moving down this far, now it's going into a limestone layer. This is what we call bedrock, because underneath the soil there's rock, and if it happens to be limestone, then this really acidic soil water is hitting this limestone, and of course that's going to dissolve it. This is generally the basis for caves. So as more and more rainwater hits certain areas, it'll start carving a path, and that path will mean that even more water kind of flows into that pathway and carves even more, and then that will eventually lead to a cave formation. Once you already have a cave formed, this also creates an interesting dynamic. All right, so let's imagine now this is the center of a cave down here. So this is our cave, and we're at the ceiling. And above the ceiling is limestone. That's our bedrock. And above our limestone is the soil. And right here you can see a little drip of water on the top of our cave. And this little drip of water basically was once rain, and then it worked its way through the soil, and then it's worked its way through the limestone, and then now it's worked its way to the top of the cave. Okay. Well, when it's rain, we know it's an acid. And as that acid begins working its way through this limestone, it's going to dissolve calcium. And actually, it's going to slowly become more and more loaded with more and more calcium, just kind of like our vinegar solution overnight got more and more calcium in it. The longer I let it sit, it's just working its way more and more and more calcium. So when this drop of water comes to the top of the cave, it is loaded with calcium. It is saturated with calcium. And that calcium is all dissolved. It's all there. This little drip of water looks very clear, but it actually has a lot of calcium in it. And what happens is that when this drop of water reaches the top of the cave, a little bit of carbon dioxide gas will escape because it's loaded with calcium, but it's also more acidic than typical rainwater. And it picked up all that acidity from the soil, and it will kind of degasify a tiny bit here and release a little bit of carbon dioxide. And this can actually be a little bit dangerous in caves. Some caves, all this carbon dioxide being released by the water will put a pretty high carbon dioxide level in the cave. And especially this can be an issue if people get trapped in a cave or something for a long time. The carbon dioxide from their breath can build up as well and can eventually create a bit of a toxic environment in caves without a lot of oxygen. But anyway, so when this water releases carbon dioxide into the cave atmosphere, it will become less acidic. Remember, carbon dioxide being dissolved in the water is what created the acid in the first place. And so in this moment, at the top of this cave for this drop of water, the pH is going from being more acidic to becoming more basic. Or in other words, the calcium that is dissolved in the water is going from an environment that's more like vinegar to an environment that's more like ammonia. And you can imagine what happens with that. That dissolved calcium precipitates out or undissolves, and every drop of water will bring a little bit of calcium to undissolve in a cave. And over time, as we get more and more water, drip, 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 dripping, what happens is that this formation will get bigger and bigger and bigger and longer and longer and longer over time, because each drop of water leaves behind a tiny, tiny amount of undissolved calcium, which basically, looks like limestone. And the eventual result of this is this crazy, wild-looking cave that you see in some places in the world, where you have all these just kind of unbelievable-looking formations, some of which take over 200,000 years to form. And one last additional detail, while we're on the subject of calcium dissolving and undissolving or precipitating, is this concept of precipitation of calcium is also relevant for oceans and where new limestone can come from. We've already talked about how rainwater is a little bit acidic, like a 5 or 6. River water, as that rain is kind of landed and then eventually making its way to a river, some of the carbon dioxide will leave it and it will become more neutral again. So typical river pH is more like a 7. And then by the time you make it all the way down to the ocean, you've dissolved all kinds of alkali substances and more carbon dioxide is left. And ocean water pH is actually a weak base. But we see a similar pattern here. We're going from a weak acid to a weak base, and in the process, any calcium that's dissolved by the acid will be undissolved by the time it makes it to the ocean. And so calcium dissolved by the acidic rain will eventually find its way to the ocean, which is a basic environment, and that can cause precipitation in the ocean. And you can kind of see that. This picture here, a satellite photo of, this is a river here flowing down into the ocean. And you can see all this whitish stuff on the coastline. A lot of that is sand, but some of it is calcium. And that calcium is kind of like we watched in class when I added the ammonia to the vinegar calcium solution. It's undissolving all that calcium, and then it can sink to the bottom of the ocean and form potentially new limestone. Or it can be used by sea creatures, like coral and clams and snails and all that stuff. All right, so that kind of wraps up this lab and a lot of these chemistry concepts that we've been learning. Is this stuff crucially important for you to learn in your lifetime? I mean, not necessarily, right? I'll admit that. But at the same time, it's really neat. All this chemistry that we've learned in our lifetime, acids and bases and elements and solutions and all this stuff, chemical reactions, all those things, when you combine them together and look at something as crazy as these cave formations, it's a neat idea that you can actually explain something that beautiful and wonderful with chemistry and ideas of chemistry and biogeochemical cycles. And you never know, you might find your way into a cave one day, spelunking around. It's really neat and interesting. I recommend it to anybody. There are lots of caves in Texas, aren't even that far away from Houston, and all over the United States. My personal favorite is Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. Never quite seen anything like it. And when you're there, maybe you'll think about all this stuff and realize that you understand how all this formed, whereas the average person has no idea. So I hope you learned something. I hope it wasn't too tedious, and I hope you have a great day. Talk to you guys later.